Look at him taking a seat like he belongs here." The words slipped from Severin's lips, sharp and quiet but heavy enough to cut the air. A thin man stood in the grand hall wrapped in a coat worn down to threads. The chandeliers above gleamed like cold crowns, and under their shine his figure looked smaller, like a shadow dragged in from the street. Eyes followed him, sliding over his shoulders with silent judgment. Some smirked, some looked away. He asked for the cheapest dish, nothing more, and folded into the corner as if he were trying to disappear. Severin's mouth curled again, contempt resting there like venom. To him, the man was a stain on marble floors, a misplaced mark in a room of polished glass. No one knew behind that silence, behind that frail coat, sat Jackson, the man who owned every inch of the place. Jackson chose the farthest corner where shadows clung to the walls. A single lamp spilled its pale gold across his face, carving it in halves, one side hidden, the other marked with quiet fatigue. He poured himself water, the glass trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes, deep and unreadable, followed no one. Severin approached, his voice dry as dust. "That's all you want?" The question carried no care, only disdain. Around them, laughter rose from polished tables, silver clinking like reminders of wealth. Jackson sat still, a lone figure in a hall of opulence, his silence louder than any retort. The air turned colder, as if the chandeliers themselves had withdrawn their warmth. He seemed diminished by the space, yet his stillness carried a weight that unsettled. No one noticed the distance between man and marble was already drawn. Severin's tone shifted the moment he turned from Jackson. At another table, wealth gleamed through silk cuffs and golden watches. He bowed, low lips softening into syrup, voice coated with false honey. Every gesture was crafted for favor, each smile stretched wider than the last. The guests laughed freely, glasses raised, one of them clapping Severin on the shoulder as if he were a trusted friend. The servant's back straightened, pride swelling in him like air filling a hollow drum. He laughed, with them, eyes flashing toward Jackson's corner where silence still sat. The contrast was sharp devotion poured out for those who shone contempt, reserved for the one who did not. In Severin's grin lived his truth. Respect was currency given only to those who could pay for it. The harshness thinned when Marceline approached the neglected table. Her steps were quiet, carrying no weight but intention. She bent slightly, smiled gentle, and filled Jackson's half-empty glass with water. "Do you need anything else?" she whispered, her voice more kindness than a question. Jackson raised his head, meeting her gaze with an expression that softened for the first time. He shook his head slowly, gratitude flickering in his eyes. That small exchange bent the cold around them like a single flame, pushing back frost. Severin's sneer, Olivar's silence, the distant laughter all faded for a breath. In that fragile moment, warmth re-entered the room, not through chandeliers or wealth, but through a simple act of respect offered to a man the world had chosen to ignore. Olivar sat only a table away, his wine untouched. His brow furrowed as Severin's voice, sharp and dismissive, cut through the air. Leaning closer to his companion, he whispered, "Shameful, truly shameful." His words carried weight, yet they fell into the quiet between them unanswered. Though indignation stirred in his chest, his hands remained flat on the table, unmoving. He chose silence over action, the restraint of a man unwilling to disturb the comfort of others. Still his eyes lingered on the corner, restless, unsettled. There was conflict in them, anger, restrained compassion, unspoken. The tension spread like a low current beneath polished floors, invisible yet undeniable. The injustice hung heavy, and in Olivar's quiet hesitation lived the truth of many, the witness who sees, who knows, but does not intervene. The scene held its breath, waiting for what he might do next. Severin returned with the soup movements, careless, almost cruel. He set the bowl down, hard, the liquid leaping over the rim, splashing onto the white cloth. Not a flicker of apology crossed his face. Instead, his lips curled with disdain as he muttered, "Eat it before it turns cold." The words dripped like spoiled wine, sour and unkind. A few diners nearby turned their heads, frowning, curiosity sharpening into disapproval. Jackson lifted the spoon unhurried, as though the insult had not reached him. His silence was heavier than anger, as though he carried an ocean beneath his ribs and refused to let a drop spill. The scene exposed Severin's contempt like a wound, raw, visible, undeniable. The coldness was no longer private. It spread into the room, pressing against everyone present. Severin's quiet laugh followed him as he turned his back, the sound cutting like glass. Marceline stood nearby, biting her lip until it blanched her eyes, burning with silent protest. Jackson placed the spoon down, his movements calm, deliberate. From the inside pocket of his worn coat, he drew out a small notebook. Its cover was plain, the edges frayed, yet when he opened it, the pages seemed to drink the light. He leaned over, hand steady, and began to write. Line after line appeared, each stroke measured final. No expression betrayed his thoughts. To onlookers it was strange, unsettling, a man insulted, yet not rising, only recording. Whispers stirred at the edges of the hall. Curiosity grew. What was he writing? Why? In that simple act, the room's unease shifted into a deeper intrigue, as though a secret had been set in motion. The dish placed before Jackson was wrong, an order he had never spoken. Severin did not even glance at him, only muttered with a curl of his lip, "Eat it anyway." The words carried the weight of command, not service. Jackson lifted his gaze, meeting the man's eyes for a brief second. He did not argue, did not protest. Instead, he lowered his head once more, pen scratching across the page of his worn notebook. Each line written seemed to harden the silence around him. A couple seated nearby shook their heads, displeasure flickering on their faces. They had seen the exchange, felt the insult, yet they too remained quiet. The moment settled in the air, brittle and sharp, another rung in a ladder of disdain climbing steadily higher. What should have been hospitality had turned to humiliation, visible to all. Marceline noticed the error almost immediately. She stepped forward, correcting the dish with practiced hands. Her voice was low, carrying a sincerity rare in the room. "I'm sorry, sir," she said gently, setting the right plate before Jackson. His eyes lifted once more, softer now, as if acknowledging a kindness too often withheld. A small nod conveyed his acceptance, gratitude, unspoken, yet clear. The tension in the air shifted briefly, a fragile reprieve carved by her gesture. Severin, watching from a distance, released a short, disdainful breath, a sound of irritation rather than guilt. His scorn hung heavy, poisoning the space she had tried to cleanse. Around them, conversation resumed, but the undercurrent of unease deepened. The contrast sharpened. Cruelty, unchallenged kindness, unnoticed, a world tilting further out of balance. The doors opened, and a wave of perfume and silk swept inside. A wealthy group entered, their laughter filling the air before they had even sat down. Severin transformed instantly, his spine straight, his smile wide, rushing to greet them with the eagerness of a man meeting royalty. Wine bottles appeared, corks loosed with flourish, laughter rolling like thunder across the hall. In his rush, Severin abandoned Jackson entirely, leaving him waiting forgotten at his corner table. Jackson remained seated, hands folded, his notebook closed for now. No glass was refilled, no word spoken to him. The disparity was naked, lavish attention for those who glittered, cold neglect for the one who did not. The injustice settled heavy, a truth impossible to ignore. Here value was measured not by humanity, but by the weight of coin. Jackson remained waiting. His posture, calm, his silence unbroken. His fingers tapped a slow rhythm against the closed notebook, a sound too soft to disturb, yet heavy enough to mark time. Marceline appeared again, carrying the dish with careful hands. She set it before him and offered another apology, her voice carrying the same quiet sincerity. Jackson looked up, his eyes holding hers for a moment, gratitude flickering like a muted flame. He nodded, once the gesture enough to speak volumes. The air around them softened, if only for a breath. Across the hall, Severin watched, irritation tightening his jaw. His eyes hardened not at the customer's silence, but at the servant's act of kindness. To him, patience looked like weakness, gratitude like defiance. The tension pressed closer, the silence stretching thin as though waiting for the inevitable break. Severin returned, voice loud enough to carry across tables. "Order something or leave it. Make up your mind." The words struck not only Jackson, but everyone within earshot. Conversations faltered, forks hovered midair. Murmurs rose, the sound of disapproval growing like ripples in a pond. Jackson did not move, his silence a shield that neither broke nor bent. His eyes lowered unbothered, as though the insult belonged to another. At a nearby table, Olivar's brows drew together, his jaw tight with unspoken anger. He looked as if he might speak, but the moment passed, swallowed by restraint. Around them, the atmosphere thickened, the weight of humiliation dragging at every ear that heard. Severin stood taller, mistaking silence for surrender, his arrogance swelling to fill the space. Jackson opened his notebook once more, pen gliding smoothly across the page. Each line he wrote seemed deliberate, measured, final. Severin noticed and let out a short, contemptuous laugh. What could you possibly be writing so much about? He sneered the words, dripping with mockery. Marceline, unable to stay silent, whispered urgently, "Enough. Stop this." Her voice trembled with both fear and anger. Severin dismissed her with a flick of his hand as though her plea were nothing but air. The room tightened, the tension becoming palpable, a living thing that coiled around every table. Guests exchanged wary glances, recognizing the cruelty but unwilling to interfere. All eyes drifted back to the notebook, the object now carrying more weight than the insult itself. What was in it? Why did he write? The questions lingered unspoken but sharp. A call from the wealthier table pulled Severin away, his eagerness visible as he hurried to attend them. Left behind, Jackson closed his notebook with care, laying it flat upon the table as if sealing a thought. The sudden stillness spread around him, heavy and unbroken. From his place nearby, Olivar's gaze sharpened, lingering on the man in silence, studying him with an intensity that betrayed suspicion. Marceline lingered in the background, her brows drawn tight, worry etched into her features. The hall continued its performance of laughter and clinking glasses, yet around that corner table hung a fragile quiet, a pocket of unease. It felt as though the room itself was waiting, breath held for what might come when the silence finally broke. When Severin returned, his grin was sharp, almost theatrical. He leaned toward the table, eyes glinting with malice. "Not to your taste," he sneered loud enough for others to hear. A few guests at nearby tables chuckled, not with cruelty but with the awkward laughter of those who witness a scene and choose amusement over intervention. Jackson did not answer. Instead, he reopened his notebook pen, steady as it carved another line across the page. His silence was not weakness. It was a wall Severin could not climb. Yet the insult lingered in the air, heavy, thickening the atmosphere until it pressed on every chest. Marceline stood rigid at the side, her hands tightening around the order pad she held, knuckles pale. What might have been a passing cruelty had become something sustained, corrosive, growing sharper with every moment left unanswered. The balance shifted again when Marceline approached, carrying a small basket of bread. She set it gently on Jackson's table, her voice low and warm. "A gift, sir." The simple offering broke through the frost that had settled around him. Jackson looked up, the faintest smile brushing his lips, a brief spark of warmth in his otherwise unreadable face. For an instant his eyes softened, a silent acknowledgment of her kindness. From across the hall, Severin noticed and frowned, irritation flashing across his features. To him, generosity toward this man was wasted effort. Yet to those who watched, the contrast grew sharper, cruelty on one side, compassion on the other. In that moment, hope threaded through the room, delicate but undeniable, proving that even in the coldest spaces, kindness still had the power to alter the air. Severin moved among the wealthy like a man reborn. His laughter rang louder than theirs, rising above the clink of glasses brimming with forced delight. He gestured broadly, boasting of the wine, boasting of the kitchen, boasting even of himself. Their wallets opened easily, tips sliding into his hand, and each coin seemed to swell his pride further. He pocketed them with a grin that split his face wide, his eyes gleaming with greedy satisfaction. When his gaze drifted back toward the quiet corner, it hardened. He looked at Jackson as one might look at dust on polished glass, an unwelcome blemish. Inwardly, he smirked, whispering to himself, "These are the real guests. That one. Nothing more than a burden." The divide became clear. Wealth defined worth, and in Severin's mind no other measure mattered. At the neglected table, Jackson's pen moved faster, line after line, until the page filled with dense handwriting. He turned it, continued filling another. His silence had not cracked, but his eyes had changed, no longer weary, no longer kind. They carried a chill, now a glint that cut sharper than words. Across the hall, Severin caught the sight, shrugged, and dismissed it with the arrogance of one who could not imagine consequence. Marceline stood near head, bowed her hands tight against her apron, unable to stop what was unfolding. At the next table, Olivar's fists clenched around his napkin, frustration trembling through his fingers. The air pressed heavier, the question growing louder in every mind: what was Jackson writing, and why did his gaze feel so cold? The mystery grew thick enough to choke. Severin returned once more, carrying a glass of water. He set it down with deliberate force, the liquid spilling over the rim, soaking the cloth. His smile was thin, cruel. "Sorry," he said with mock innocence, "slipped my hand." The words dripped with sarcasm. Several diners turned to watch, their expressions grim, their silence heavy. Jackson reached calmly for a napkin, wiping the spill with unhurried movements as though the insult had never landed. The patience in his every gesture seemed unnatural, almost frightening in its steadiness. Marceline's eyes burned red tears threatening to rise as she watched. To her, this was no accident. It was humiliation disguised as error, a cruelty dressed in service. The tension grew harsher, no longer subtle, the abuse naked for all to see. Yet Jackson endured each slight sinking deeper into the silence he guarded. Olivar leaned closer to his companion, voice lowered but edged with frustration. "That man. He's pitiful," he whispered, eyes fixed on Jackson's lonely figure. His friend shook his head, tone measured, almost wary. "No, not pitiful. There's something strange about him." The words hung in the air, unsettling in their quiet certainty. Around them, diners shifted uncomfortably, some stealing glances toward the corner table. Doubt rippled through the room, sympathy tangled with suspicion. Jackson sat unmoving, then closed his eyes as though sealing himself away from the noise. A long breath left him heavy with restraint. His hand tightened on the notebook, the knuckles whitening under the strain. In that single motion, mystery deepened. He was no longer merely a victim to be pitied, but a figure wrapped in questions no one dared answer aloud. Severin cleared another table, the clatter of dishes sharp in the background. As he passed, his eyes flicked toward Jackson, a sneer tugging at his lips as if mocking the man's persistence in simply being there. At the far side, the wealthy beckoned, and Severin hurried, eager to please. Jackson, untouched by the noise, returned to his writing. His pen moved steadily, each line laid down with quiet determination. Marceline watched from a distance, her face pale, her concern deepening with every stroke of his hand. She sensed the weight behind his silence, a pressure that grew heavier the longer he endured. The room, though filled with chatter and music, felt tight-coiled, as though silence itself had become dangerous. Every eye, drawn to the corner, waited for a crack that refused to come. Severin returned once more, carrying a plate not meant for Jackson. He placed it down with mock cheer, his smile cutting. "Try something new," he said, the words coated with scorn. Jackson frowned slightly, the first flicker of resistance in his face, before lowering his head to record another line in his book. Marceline's patience broke. "Stop it. Don't do this," she burst out, her voice rising above the hum of the dining hall. For a moment, the clatter of silverware and the flow of conversation ceased. A stunned silence blanketed the room. Eyes turned toward them, the air crackling with tension. Severin's smirk faltered, if only for an instant. Marceline stood trembling but resolute. In her defiance, the balance shifted. The cruelty had been named, and the silence could no longer protect it. Severin's temper broke his words sharp enough to sting the entire hall. "Stay quiet. This is my work, not yours." The venom in his tone cut at Marceline, her head bowing under the weight of his scorn. Tears welled trembling at the edges of her eyes, yet she forced herself to remain in place, shoulders drawn in like a wounded bird. Jackson lifted his gaze to her, and for the briefest moment his expression softened his silence, no longer cold, but protective. Across the room, Olivar ground his teeth, the restraint on his anger audible in the tightness of his breath. Around them, unease shifted into outrage, a collective stir in the audience of diners. Severin's cruelty had no disguise left. It stood bare, unashamed, a revelation of character that could not be undone. From a nearby table, a younger patron leaned closer to his companion, voice lowered but insistent. "That man. He looks familiar." His companion nodded slowly, puzzlement etched into his face. "Yes, but I can't place him." Their whispers rippled outward, curiosity threading through the silence. Jackson sat taller, his posture firm, as though the storm around him no longer touched him. His hands rested calmly on the notebook, but there was no tremor in him now. His stillness carried weight, dignity revealed beneath the guise of frailty. Severin, too, consumed by his own performance, remained blind to the change. He did not see the glances turning, did not hear the murmurs building. The seed of mystery had taken root, and the room itself leaned toward the man in the corner, questions sharpening with every breath. At the far end, the wealthy guests offered praise and laughter, their approval spilling over Severin like wine from a generous cup. He basked in it, his grin wide, his chest swelling with borrowed glory. As he turned back toward the corner, the mask slipped into contempt. His voice dropped low, words meant to wound rather than serve. "Trash. That's all you are." The insult, though muttered, carried enough venom to poison the air around him. Marceline's fists clenched at her sides, her body trembling with the urge to speak, yet fear kept her rooted. Olivar inhaled sharply, holding himself back from the eruption that threatened. The hall seemed to pause, collective outrage simmering just beneath the surface. Severin's malice had crossed into the unforgivable, and silence could no longer hide it. Jackson closed the notebook with deliberate calm, the sound of its cover meeting itself a quiet finality. He placed it on the table, fingers lingering for a breath before retreating. When he lifted his eyes, they were no longer muted by patience, they gleamed with a cold clarity that unsettled. Severin, catching the look, faltered for an instant, unease flickering across his face, but pride smothered the warning. He dismissed it, convincing himself the man was powerless. Across the hall, Marceline sensed the shift. Her chest tightened, heart pounding against her ribs, the rhythm of dread and expectation. Olivar leaned forward in his chair, eyes locked on the corner. Around them, conversation thinned, laughter faltered. The air pressed close taut as a drawn bowstring. Something unseen but undeniable prepared to break. Severin strode back, arrogance swelling to its highest pitch. He leaned in, his voice raised so no one could ignore it. "What do you think this is a charity hall?" The words cracked through the air, scattering silence into stunned fragments. Every corner of the dining room froze. Forks, suspended glasses halted midway. The insult, sharp and public, reverberated off marble and glass like a gavel striking judgment. Marceline trembled, her hands pressed tight together, unable to hide her fear. Olivar gripped his chair knuckles, pale fury, restrained but ready to burst. All eyes turned to the table in the corner, waiting to see what the quiet man would do. The moment had reached its limit. Humiliation had climbed to its highest rung. The room balanced on the edge of a fall. The hall fell into absolute stillness, a silence so complete it roared in the ears. Severin let out a short, mocking laugh, certain of his dominance, but the sound died when Jackson moved. Slowly, with unhurried grace, he rose from his chair. He brushed a hand across his worn coat, a simple gesture that carried weight, as though shaking off not dust, but the contempt piled upon him. He straightened, and in that posture alone something shifted, the fragile, frail image dissolved. Every gaze in the room locked onto him, curiosity and unease tightening into awe. The quiet man was no longer invisible. He had claimed the air itself, and for the first time Severin's sneer looked uncertain. The confrontation had arrived, and nothing could return to what it was before. Jackson's voice broke the silence, deep and resonant, a sound that carried through the hall without strain. "Enough." The single word struck sharper than any shout. Severin flinched, his confidence cracking at the edges. The laughter he had relied on from other tables vanished. The room seemed to lean toward the corner, pulled by the gravity of that voice. Marceline's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief, as though she had just witnessed the impossible. Olivar shifted forward in his chair, breath caught ready for revelation. Around them, diners froze, forks and glasses suspended midair, no one daring to disturb the moment. Silence thickened, not with neglect this time, but with expectation. For the first time, it was Severin who stood small, dwarfed by the quiet authority rising before him. Jackson lowered his hand, placing the notebook back on the table as though setting down a weapon. His gaze lifted cold and precise, cutting through the distance between him and Severin. The younger man faltered, his bravado reduced to a stammer. "You—" He began, the word dissolving before it found shape. Jackson did not answer. He let the silence speak heavier than any declaration. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to echo against marble walls, filling the space with pressure. The notebook sat in plain sight now, its presence undeniable. More than paper and ink, it had become judgment itself. Severin swallowed hard, his voice gone, his arrogance muted. In the stillness, the balance reversed power no longer lay in noise, but in the quiet certainty of what had been written. Jackson's words returned, measured, deliberate, each syllable like a stone, dropped into water. Every word, every gesture. "I have written it all." The sentence fell across the room with the weight of finality. Severin stumbled a step back as if struck by something unseen. Whispers stirred among the diners, rippling like wind through leaves. Doubt turned to recognition, recognition to fear. Marceline's tears spilled over her hand, trembling as she pressed it against her lips, unable to contain the emotion building inside her. The air grew dense, suffocating, the weight of truth pressing on every chest. Jackson had shifted from shadow to accuser, from silent figure to voice of judgment. The ledger of cruelty was no longer hidden. It had been spoken aloud, and the room itself bore witness. Jackson's voice rose again, steady, unshaken, yet carrying the weight of revelation. "Because I am not merely a guest. I am Jackson, the owner of this house." The words struck like thunder reverberating against marble and glass. The entire hall froze, the air carved into silence. Faces turned wide-eyed mouths parted in disbelief. Severin's jaw fell open, but no sound followed his arrogance, silenced at its root. Marceline trembled, her body rigid, tears threatening to fall as recognition dawned. Olivar leaned forward, his voice breaking the silence in a whisper. "I knew it." The grandeur of the hall seemed to shrink around the man in the corner. No longer faceless, no longer small, he stood revealed as the one whose presence outweighed them all. The fragile balance shattered the truth, undeniable. Severin found his voice at last, though it quivered with disbelief. You're lying." His protest lacked conviction, crumbling under the gaze of the man before him. Jackson opened the notebook once more, his voice unwavering as he began to read. Each error recited was a blatant neglect of service insults delivered, cruelty disguised as duty. The hall listened, every word sharp, every detail undeniable. Murmurs spread, disgust building as diners shifted their eyes, falling on Severin with condemnation. He lowered his head, the weight of shame forcing him down. Each accusation struck harder than the last until there was no laughter left in the room, only judgment. The man who had mocked was now on trial, and the record of his own actions was his undoing. Jackson's tone softened, yet his actions carried greater weight than any word. From his coat, he drew a wallet, simple but certain, and placed a card on the table. "Every table here," he said, "I will cover tonight." A collective gasp followed. Then the hall erupted, chairs, scraped voices rose in disbelief and astonishment. The gesture was both gift and statement generosity that cut through cruelty, leaving no room for doubt. Severin's face glistened with sweat, his composure gone, his shame magnified under the kindness he could never show. Marceline's eyes widened, awe filling her as she watched him transform contempt into grace. What had begun as humiliation ended in triumph, but not for the server who sought to belittle, for the man who chose dignity, silence, and power revealed at the final moment. Jackson's gaze settled on Severin, steady and unblinking. His voice cut through the quiet calm, yet unyielding. "You believed small customers were worth nothing. Tonight you have learned what true worth is." The words hung heavy, not merely rebuke, but judgment wrapped in truth. Severin's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped, swallowed by the shame pressing on him. Across the hall, heads nodded recognition, passing from table to table. Olivar exhaled relief, breaking through his clenched jaw as though the justice he had longed for had finally arrived. Marceline's tears spilled freely, her shoulders trembling with both grief and release. The message needed no adornment, no defense. It was truth laid bare, a reminder that dignity is not priced, that respect is owed to all. The hall bowed beneath the weight of those words. The judgment sharpened colder now. Jackson's voice no longer carried warmth, only steel. "Severin, you are suspended for 1 week." The announcement cracked across the room like a sentence passed in court. Severin staggered back a step, his face drained of color, disbelief spreading across it. Murmurs rippled among the diners, some shocked, others whispering approval. Marceline lowered her eyes, fear mingling with sympathy. She had hoped for consequences, but trembled at their weight. Olivar leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming not of joy, but of vindication. The balance had shifted completely. The servant who mocked was now silenced, the man he scorned revealed as master. The hall no longer looked at Jackson as an invisible figure. They saw authority unshaken and undeniable. Jackson did not stop. His tone deepened each syllable a verdict, not for rest, but to relearn respect. The phrase dropped like iron into the silence, echoing through the still hall. Severin's face blanched, lips trembling, the weight of shame pressing him lower with each word. The guests who had once laughed now held their silence, not daring to smile, not daring to soften what had been spoken. The lesson stretched beyond the man himself. It filled the air, a warning etched into every witness. Marceline's eyes lifted for the first time, her fear tempered by relief, knowing that cruelty had met its boundary. The atmosphere bore down, heavy, oppressive, not with humiliation this time, but with the sharpness of truth. Respect was no longer a request, it was law. Jackson's sternness eased as he turned toward Marceline. A rare smile touched his lips, faint but genuine. "You saved the soul of this place," he said, his voice steady with gratitude. From his pocket he produced a small envelope and placed it in her hands. The gesture was simple, yet it rang louder than any applause. Marceline broke, tears spilling as she covered her face, sobs escaping in relief. Around them, a light applause began, hesitant at first, then growing soft but resolute. It was not for spectacle, but for recognition and acknowledgement that kindness had not gone unseen. Severin's cruelty had filled the night, but here, in this moment, compassion was rewarded before all. The lesson, settled cruelty tarnishes, but small acts of humanity can redeem an entire room. Severin's head hung low, beads of sweat tracing his brow. He could not meet a single gaze, shame bending his frame into silence. Jackson turned away his footsteps, calm, carrying authority that no one questioned. His voice rose once more, deep and unwavering. "A good meal brings a guest back once. Respect brings them back forever." The hall froze, his words etching themselves into the air like a final decree. No glass clinked, no murmur rose. Silence reigned heavy with reflection. The diners knew this was no passing remark, but a truth carved into stone. Severin trembled behind him. Marceline wept softly, and Olivar closed his eyes as though sealing the moment. The hall had witnessed cruelty, and now it carried its warning dignity as the only currency that never loses value. Kindness keeps them coming back forever. Jackson's final words lingered, cutting deeper than any rebuke. The guests bowed their heads, not in obedience but in recognition, humbled by truth laid bare. Marceline wiped her tears, steadied by the weight of hope restored. Severin trembled, the mask of arrogance shattered his silence, now punishment enough. The hall itself seemed to reflect its grandeur, stripped of pride, left only as a mirror for those willing to see. That night the restaurant became more than a place of meals, it became a reckoning, and only those brave enough to face it could begin again.